The porcelain cup shattered against the marble floor before Charles Ashford even finished his sentence. Margaret Ashford stood frozen by the window of the drawing room, her hand still raised from where the cup had slipped from her fingers. Her son had just told her, calmly and without warning, that he had married a woman named Elena Hartley 3 weeks earlier in a small chapel outside Vienna. No family present, no announcement, no permission sought. "Say that again," Margaret said, her voice low and dangerous. "You heard me the first time, Mother," Charles replied, standing tall in the doorway of Ashcombe Hall, still in his traveling coat, his boots leaving faint marks on the polished floor. "I am married. Her name is Elena. She will be joining us within the week." Margaret's face went through several colors before settling on a pale, furious white. She had spent years planning her son's future, arranging quiet introductions with daughters of respectable families, women with proper lineage and proper manners. She had imagined a wedding at the cathedral in the city, guests numbering in the hundreds, her son's marriage becoming the talk of society for years to come. Instead, she was being told about it after the fact, as though she were a servant receiving instructions, rather than the Duchess Dowager of Ashcombe. "And who exactly is this Elena Hartley?" Margaret asked, each word clipped and sharp. "What family does she come from? What is her father's name? Her mother's maiden name?" Charles hesitated for only a moment, but it was enough for Margaret to notice. "She works as a translator," he said. "She helped me during the trade negotiations in Vienna. Her family is not wealthy, Mother, but she is intelligent, kind, and she makes me happier than I have ever been." Margaret let out a short, humorless laugh. "A translator? You have married a translator. Do you understand what this means for our family name? Do you understand what people will say?" "I understand exactly what they will say," Charles said, his jaw tightening, "and I do not care." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Margaret turned back toward the window, staring out at the vast green grounds of Ashcombe Hall, the hedges trimmed into perfect geometric shapes, the fountain in the distance catching the afternoon light. Everything about the estate spoke of order, tradition, and control. And now her son had brought chaos into it, with a single decision made an ocean away. "She will need to be tested," Margaret said finally, without turning around. "Tested," Charles repeated, an edge of suspicion creeping into his voice. "Introduced properly," Margaret corrected, though the correction did nothing to soften her tone. "A dinner. The family. Close friends. People who matter. If she is to become the next Duchess of Ashcombe, she must be seen, and she must be judged fit for the role." Charles studied his mother's rigid shoulders, the way her hands gripped the windowsill until her knuckles paled. He knew her well enough to sense that something more calculated was forming behind her words, but he was too relieved that she had not outright forbidden the marriage to press further. "Fine," he said, "a dinner. But you will treat her with respect, Mother. She is my wife now. Nothing you say or do will change that." Margaret finally turned to face him, and for the briefest moment, something like a smile touched the corner of her mouth. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a woman who had already begun planning 3 steps ahead. "Of course, my darling," she said sweetly. "We will welcome her with open arms." Charles did not trust that smile, but he had no time to question it further. Word had already begun to spread through the household staff, whispered between the kitchen and the stables, carried up the servants' stairs, and into the private chambers of Ashcombe Hall. By evening, every person living within those walls knew that the Duke had married a stranger, a woman with no title, no fortune, and no family name that meant anything to the circles that mattered. In the east wing of the estate, in a small sitting room reserved for private family gatherings, Margaret sat with her sister-in-law, Constance Whitfield, a woman whose sharp tongue was matched only by her sharper eyes. Constance had married into minor nobility decades ago and had spent every year since perfecting the art of appearing gracious while delivering devastating judgments. "A translator," Constance said, swirling the wine in her glass. "How positively common." "She is nothing," Margaret said, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. "A nobody who caught my son's eye during a moment of weakness. He was tired, he was far from home, and she took advantage of that. And now, she expects to sit at the head of this family," Constance mused. "To wear the Ashcombe name as though she earned it through birth, rather than through some fortunate accident of proximity." Margaret's fingers tightened around her own glass. "She will not last. I intend to see to that personally. Constance raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. And how do you propose to accomplish this, without appearing cruel to your son? He seems rather protective of his new bride. Margaret allowed herself a small, cold smile. Charles believes I am planning a welcoming dinner, and I am. A dinner where everyone will have the chance to observe her, to speak with her, to determine exactly what kind of woman has inserted herself into our family. And if she proves unsuitable, she will prove unsuitable, Margaret said with absolute certainty. Women like her always do, eventually. They simply need enough rope to reveal themselves. Constance leaned forward, intrigued now. You have something specific in mind. Margaret's smile widened slightly. German, she said simply. Constance blinked, confused for a moment, before understanding dawned across her features. The Ashcombe family, along with most of their closest friends and relations, had spoken German fluently for generations, a tradition passed down from a great-grandmother who had come from Bavaria. It was the language of private jokes at public gatherings, of comments made about other guests while smiling politely in English moments before and after. You intend to speak about her, Constance said slowly, in front of her face. She is a common girl from an unremarkable background, Margaret said. The odds that she speaks a second language, let alone German specifically, are practically non-existent. We will smile, we will welcome her, and we will say precisely what we think of her, in a language she will never understand. Constance let out a delighted laugh, the kind of laugh that suggested she had not been this entertained in months. Margaret, that is positively wicked. It is honest, Margaret corrected. If she truly belongs in this family, she will survive an evening of conversation, regardless of the language spoken. If she does not belong, we will know within the hour, and Charles will eventually see reason. News of the plan spread quietly among the guests invited to the dinner, shared in hushed tones over telephone calls and private letters. Baron Edward Lowry, a distant cousin known for his biting wit, found the entire scheme delightful and eagerly confirmed his attendance. William Grant, an old friend of the family who had known Charles since childhood, was more hesitant, expressing mild discomfort with the plan, though not enough discomfort to decline the invitation. It seems rather unkind, William said, during a brief conversation with Margaret over tea. The poor woman has no idea what she is walking into. She is walking into a family dinner, Margaret replied smoothly. Nothing more. If she happens to overhear opinions expressed in a language she cannot understand, that is hardly our fault. William did not look entirely convinced, but he said nothing further. Ashcombe Hall had a way of pulling people into its traditions, its expectations, its quiet insistence that things be done a certain way regardless of personal reservations. Meanwhile, far from the manicured grounds of the estate, Elena Hartley sat in a small apartment in the city, carefully packing a single suitcase. She held up a simple blue dress, examining the fabric for any signs of wear before folding it neatly and placing it inside. Her movements were precise, unhurried, the movements of a woman accustomed to living with very little and making the most of what she had. Elena had grown up in a modest household, raised primarily by her grandmother after her parents passed away when she was young. There had been no fortune waiting for her, no family name that opened doors. What she did have was an extraordinary gift for languages, a mind that absorbed grammar and vocabulary the way other minds absorbed music. By the time she was 20, she spoke 5 languages fluently, German among them, learned not from privilege but from necessity, from years spent working odd jobs in cities where survival depended on communication. It was this gift that had brought her into contact with Charles during the trade negotiations in Vienna. She had been hired as a translator for the delegation, a temporary position meant to last only a few weeks. Instead, she had found herself drawn into long conversations with the quiet, thoughtful Duke, who seemed far more interested in understanding people than in impressing them. Elena closed her suitcase and looked around the small apartment that had been her home for the past 2 years. She felt no sadness in leaving it behind, only a quiet anticipation for what lay ahead, tempered by a realistic understanding of what she would likely face. She was not naive. She understood that marrying a duke meant marrying into a world that would judge her, question her, and likely try to find reasons to reject her. She had heard enough about Margaret Ashford through Charles's careful diplomatic descriptions to understand that his mother was not a woman who welcomed surprises easily. But Elena had faced difficult situations before. She had learned, over years of working in unfamiliar cities, among unfamiliar people, that the best response to hostility was rarely confrontation. It was patience. It was observation. It was allowing people to reveal themselves fully before deciding how to respond. Charles arrived at her apartment that evening, looking slightly more tired than when he had left for Ashcombe Hall that morning. He kissed her gently and settled into the single chair beside her small kitchen table. "How did your mother take the news?" Elena asked, though something in his expression already told her the answer. "About as well as I expected," Charles admitted with a tired smile. "She has arranged a dinner. A proper introduction, she called it. Family, close friends, the usual gathering." Elena nodded slowly, folding her hands in her lap. "And you believe this dinner is simply about introductions?" Charles hesitated, and Elena noticed the hesitation immediately. She had spent years learning to read people through subtle cues, the small pauses before answers, the way eyes shifted when someone was choosing their words carefully. "I believe my mother has more than one purpose in mind," Charles admitted finally. "She has never been a woman who does anything simply. But I promise you, Elena, whatever she attempts, I will not allow you to be treated poorly in my own home." Elena reached across the table and took his hand, offering a small, reassuring smile. "I appreciate that, Charles, but you should know something about me. I have spent my entire life being underestimated by people who assumed they understood me at a glance. I have learned to be quite comfortable with that." Charles looked at her curiously, sensing there was more beneath her calm words, but Elena said nothing further. She simply squeezed his hand and turned her attention back to her packing, her expression serene, her mind already working through the days ahead, with the same careful precision she applied to translating complex documents. 3 days later, a car arrived to take Elena to Ashcombe Hall. As she settled into the back seat, watching the city give way to open countryside, she found herself thinking not about fear, but about preparation. She thought about every conversation she had overheard in her years of translation work, every moment when people had spoken carelessly in front of her, assuming she could not understand. She thought about the years she had spent in Germany and Austria, working as an aide to diplomats who valued her not for her family name, but for her mind, her memory, and her absolute discretion. She thought about how many times she had sat quietly in rooms full of powerful people who spoke freely, never suspecting that the quiet woman taking notes understood every single word. Elena smiled softly to herself as the car rolled through the iron gates of Ashcombe Hall, the estate rising in the distance like something from an old painting. Whatever Margaret Ashford had planned, whatever games her new family intended to play, Elena felt no fear. She had walked into rooms like this before, and she had never once been the one who left them defeated. The guest list arrived on Margaret Ashford's desk precisely 1 week before the dinner, written in her own careful handwriting, each name selected with deliberate purpose. Baroness Constance Whitfield topped the list, her sharp tongue and quick wit essential to the evening's true purpose. Beside her name, Margaret had written a small note in the margin, a reminder to seat Constance close enough to Elena that every word could be heard clearly, yet far enough that the seating arrangement would appear entirely natural. Baron Edward Lowry followed next, a distant cousin whose fluency in German rivaled Margaret's own. Edward had always possessed a gift for cutting remarks delivered with a pleasant smile, a talent Margaret intended to put to full use during the evening ahead. William Grant's name appeared further down the list, included more out of obligation than enthusiasm. Margaret was aware of his reservations regarding her plan, but excluding him entirely would raise questions among the family, questions she preferred to avoid. She trusted that his loyalty to tradition would outweigh his personal discomfort. The remaining names belonged to various relatives and family friends, each one fluent in German, each one carefully briefed on the evening's unspoken agenda. Margaret had spoken with each guest individually over the past several days, framing the plan not as cruelty, but as simple curiosity, an opportunity to understand the woman who had so suddenly become part of their family. "We are merely observing," she told each guest in turn, her voice calm and reasonable. "If she happens to overhear our honest opinions, expressed in a language she cannot possibly understand, that is not deception. That is simply conversation among people who have known each other for years." Most of the guests accepted this reasoning without objection. Constance found the entire scheme thrilling, already composing witty remarks she intended to deliver over the soup course. Edward seemed equally entertained, viewing the dinner as an opportunity to display his own cleverness before an appreciative audience. William Grant remained the sole voice of hesitation. He visited Margaret privately 2 days before the dinner, finding her in the study surrounded by menus and place cards, deep in preparation for the evening ahead. "I have been thinking about this dinner," William said, settling into the chair across from her desk, "and I find myself increasingly uncomfortable with the plan." Margaret did not look up from her papers immediately. "Uncomfortable how, exactly?" "We are planning to deceive a woman in her own home," William said carefully. "A woman who has done nothing to us, who has not even had the opportunity to prove herself one way or another. It feels less like an introduction and more like an ambush." Margaret finally set down her pen and looked at him directly. "William, you have known me for many years. Do you honestly believe I would allow just anyone to marry into this family without proper examination?" Charles is impulsive. He always has been. He falls quickly and deeply, and he rarely considers the consequences of his decisions until it is far too late to reverse them. "That may be true," William admitted, "but this feels different from ordinary caution. This feels calculated to hurt her." "It is calculated to reveal her," Margaret corrected sharply. "If she has nothing to hide, if she is truly the intelligent, kind woman Charles describes, then a few overheard comments in a language she cannot speak will mean nothing to her. She will simply enjoy her dinner, charm the guests with her English conversation, and the evening will pass without incident." William studied Margaret's expression carefully, searching for any sign of doubt, but found none. Margaret Ashford had made her decision, and nothing William said would change her course. "And if she does understand?" William asked quietly. "What then?" Margaret laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "William, please. She grew up in obscurity, working odd jobs to survive. The idea that she happens to speak fluent German, on top of everything else, strains credibility beyond reason. No, she will understand nothing, and by the end of the evening, either Charles will see the truth about the woman he has married, or she will prove herself capable of handling our family's particular sense of humor. Either outcome serves our purposes." William left the study unconvinced but resigned, understanding that his objections had already been dismissed before he had even voiced them. He returned to his own estate that evening, troubled by a nagging sense that Margaret's confidence rested on assumptions rather than facts, but lacking any concrete reason to intervene further. Meanwhile, preparations at Ashcombe Hall continued with meticulous attention to detail. The dining room was polished until the long mahogany table gleamed beneath the chandeliers. Fresh flowers arrived from the greenhouse, arranged into elaborate centerpieces that stretched the length of the table. The finest silver was retrieved from storage, each piece cleaned and inspected for any hint of tarnish. Margaret walked through the dining room the evening before the dinner, examining every detail with the sharp eye of a woman who had hosted countless gatherings throughout her life. She paused beside the seat she had designated for Elena, positioned directly across from Constance and within easy earshot of Edward. "Perfect," she murmured to herself, satisfied with the arrangement. In the kitchen, the household staff prepared for the following evening with a mixture of excitement and unease. Rumors had spread quickly among the servants. Whispered conversations carried between the kitchen and the servants' quarters. Speculation about what exactly was being planned for the new bride. Henry, the estate's longtime butler, overheard several of these conversations while supervising the polishing of silverware. He had served the Ashcombe family for over 20 years, long enough to recognize the particular energy that surrounded Margaret when she was orchestrating something beyond ordinary hospitality. "Do you think it's true?" one of the younger maids asked another as they folded linen napkins into precise triangles, "that they're planning to speak German at dinner, just to talk about her without her knowing?" "I heard the same thing," the other maid replied, glancing nervously toward the door. "Seems cruel, doesn't it? The poor woman doesn't even know what she's walking into." Henry said nothing, though privately he shared their discomfort. He had served enough dinners at Ashcombe Hall to recognize when Margaret's hospitality masked something sharper beneath the surface. He resolved simply to perform his duties with his usual professionalism, offering no opinion on matters that were not his to judge. 2 days before the dinner, Charles traveled to the city to collect Elena personally, wanting to accompany her on the journey back to the estate, rather than sending a car alone. He found her waiting outside her small apartment, her single suitcase packed neatly beside her, wearing a simple gray coat that did nothing to diminish the quiet elegance she carried in her posture. "Are you ready for this?" Charles asked as they settled into the car, watching her carefully for any sign of nervousness. "I have attended dinners with far more intimidating company than your family, Charles," Elena replied with a small smile. "Diplomats, ambassadors, men and women who held the fate of entire nations in their conversations. I believe I will manage a family dinner." "My mother can be quite formidable," Charles warned, though his tone carried a hint of amusement now, reassured by Elena's calm confidence. "I imagine she can be," Elena agreed. "Most people who have spent their entire lives believing themselves entitled to judge others tend to develop a certain formidable quality. It rarely troubles me." Charles glanced at her, curious about the certainty in her voice, but Elena simply looked out the window, watching the countryside roll past, her expression thoughtful and unbothered. As they approached Ashcombe Hall, the estate came into view gradually, first the iron gates, then the long gravel drive lined with ancient oak trees, and finally, the manor itself, an imposing structure of gray stone that had stood for generations. Elena studied it with quiet interest, noting the careful maintenance, the precise landscaping, the unmistakable signs of old wealth, determined to project permanence and authority. "It's beautiful," Elena said softly. "It has been in my family for over 200 years, Charles replied with obvious pride. "My mother takes great care to preserve every tradition associated with it." Elena nodded, filing away this information alongside everything else she had learned about the Ashcombe family in recent weeks. Traditions, she understood, could be both a source of strength and a weapon, depending on how they were wielded and by whom. The car came to a stop at the entrance, and Elena stepped out gracefully, taking a moment to look up at the grand facade before her. Margaret Ashford stood waiting at the top of the stone steps, flanked by 2 members of the household staff, her expression composed into a mask of polite welcome that did not quite reach her eyes. "Elena," Margaret said, descending the steps with measured grace. "Welcome to Ashcombe Hall." "Thank you for having me, Duchess Ashford," Elena replied, her voice warm and steady, offering a respectful nod that acknowledged Margaret's position without appearing subservient. Margaret's eyes swept over Elena briefly, taking in every detail of her appearance, from her simple but well-fitted dress to her composed posture, searching for any weakness she might exploit later. Elena remained perfectly still under this scrutiny, neither shrinking nor challenging, simply present and calm. "I trust your journey was comfortable," Margaret said, turning to lead them inside. "Very comfortable, thank you," Elena replied, falling into step beside Charles as they entered the grand hallway. The interior of Ashcombe Hall matched the grandeur of its exterior, with high ceilings, ornate moldings, and portraits of ancestors lining the walls in heavy gilded frames. Elena took in every detail as they walked, her mind cataloging the layout, the decorations, the subtle signals of wealth and history that permeated every corner of the estate. Margaret led them to a small sitting room, where tea had been prepared, the fine china arranged precisely on a silver tray. As they settled into their seats, Constance Whitfield entered the room, having been informed of Elena's arrival and eager for her first glimpse of the woman who had caused such disruption within the family. "Ah, you must be Elena," Constance said, her smile bright and seemingly warm, though her eyes held the same calculating quality Elena had already noticed in Margaret's gaze. "I have heard so much about you. And I have heard a great deal about you as well, Baroness Whitfield," Elena replied smoothly. "Charles speaks very highly of his family." Constance settled into a chair beside Margaret, and the 2 women exchanged a brief glance that Elena caught but chose not to acknowledge openly. Whatever silent communication passed between them, Elena understood instinctively that it did not bode well for the evening ahead, though she gave no outward sign of concern. As tea was poured and polite conversation continued, Elena answered every question with careful, measured responses, revealing enough to seem forthcoming, while carefully avoiding any details that might be used against her later. She had learned long ago that information given freely could become a weapon in the wrong hands, and she had no intention of arming her new family with unnecessary ammunition. Charles watched the exchange with growing admiration, noticing how skillfully Elena navigated his mother's pointed questions, how she remained gracious, even when Margaret's inquiries carried subtle barbs beneath their polite surface. He began to feel a small measure of reassurance, believing that whatever challenges the dinner might bring, Elena possessed the composure necessary to face them. What Charles did not yet know was the full extent of what his mother had planned, nor did he understand that Elena's composure stemmed not from mere confidence, but from a lifetime of experience navigating exactly these kinds of hostile environments. As the afternoon light began to fade and the household staff prepared for the evening ahead, the stage was being set for a confrontation that none of the guests, save Elena herself, fully understood was already underway. Elena's room at Ashcombe Hall overlooked the eastern gardens, a spacious chamber decorated with pale blue wallpaper and heavy curtains that had likely hung there for decades. She stood by the window as the sun began to set, watching the shadows stretch long across the manicured lawns, and allowed herself a rare moment of quiet reflection before the evening ahead. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. When she opened the door, she found a young maid named Grace standing there, holding a stack of freshly pressed linens. "I hope you don't mind, my lady," Grace said nervously, clearly unaccustomed to addressing someone of Elena's new position. "I've brought extra towels, in case you need them before dinner." "Thank you, Grace," Elena said warmly, taking the linens with genuine appreciation. "That's very kind of you." Grace lingered for a moment, clearly wanting to say something further, but hesitant to overstep. Elena noticed the hesitation immediately and offered a gentle smile of encouragement. "Is there something on your mind?" Grace glanced quickly toward the hallway before lowering her voice. "It's not my place to say anything, my lady, but I do hope you enjoy your evening." There was something in the young woman's tone, a careful concern hidden beneath polite words, that told Elena more than the maid intended to reveal. Elena had spent enough years reading subtext in conversations to recognize a warning when she heard one, even one delivered so cautiously. "Thank you, Grace," Elena said simply. "I intend to." After Grace left, Elena sat at the small writing desk near the window and considered what she had learned since arriving at Ashcombe Hall. The careful way Margaret had studied her during tea, the knowing glance exchanged between Margaret and Constance, the subtle unease she had noticed among the household staff whenever the topic of the dinner arose. All of it pointed towards something beyond a simple family gathering, though Elena could not yet determine exactly what form the evening's challenges might take. She thought back to her years working alongside diplomats in Vienna and Berlin, remembering the countless dinners she had attended, where powerful men and women spoke freely in front of translators, assuming their words meant nothing, without proper interpretation, forgetting entirely that the translator herself understood every syllable long before it needed converting into another tongue. She remembered one dinner in particular, years earlier, when a foreign minister had spoken candidly in German about a trade proposal he intended to reject, believing the English delegation across the table understood nothing of what he said. Elena, seated quietly in the corner with her notepad, had understood every word and had later used that knowledge to help her own delegation negotiate more favorable terms. People underestimated quiet women who sat in corners taking notes. They always had, and Elena suspected they always would. It was, in many ways, the greatest advantage a person could possess in rooms filled with those who believed themselves the only ones capable of understanding. A second knock came at her door, this one firmer and more confident. When Elena opened it, she found Charles standing there, dressed in formal evening attire, looking slightly anxious, despite his obvious effort to appear composed. "You look beautiful," he said, taking in the elegant dark green dress Elena had chosen for the evening, simple in its design, but flattering in its cut. "Thank you," Elena replied, allowing him to take her hand, as they prepared to descend toward the dining room together. "Are you nervous?" Charles let out a short laugh. "Should I be more nervous than you? You're the one facing my entire family tonight." "I've faced worse," Elena said simply, and something in her tone made Charles pause, studying her expression more closely. "Elena," he said slowly, "is there something you haven't told me about your past?" Elena met his gaze directly, considering how much to reveal. She had chosen, throughout their courtship, to share only what felt necessary, protecting certain details of her professional history, not out of deception, but out of a lifetime habit of discretion, learned through years of diplomatic work, where discretion often meant the difference between success and disaster. "There are many things about my life you don't yet know, Charles," she said carefully. Not because I wish to hide them from you, but because some things are best revealed when the moment calls for them naturally, rather than forced out through casual conversation. Charles studied her for a long moment, clearly wanting to press further, but something in Elena's calm certainty convinced him to let the matter rest, at least for the evening ahead. "All right," he said finally, "but someday, you'll tell me everything." "Someday," Elena agreed with a small smile. "Perhaps sooner than you expect." They descended the grand staircase together, Charles's hand resting protectively at the small of Elena's back as they made their way toward the dining room, where the sound of conversation and laughter already drifted through the hallway, indicating that most of the guests had already arrived. As they entered the dining room, Elena took in the scene with practiced observation. The long mahogany table gleamed beneath the chandeliers, set with fine china and gleaming silver, elaborate flower arrangements stretching down its center. Perhaps 15 guests had already gathered, standing in small clusters, engaged in animated conversation, their laughter and chatter filling the elegant space. Margaret Ashford stood near the head of the table, deep in conversation with Baroness Constance Whitfield, both women, turning immediately as Elena and Charles entered, their expressions shifting instantly into welcoming smiles that Elena recognized as carefully practiced rather than genuine. "Elena, darling," Margaret said, gliding forward to greet them. "Come, let me introduce you to everyone." What followed was a rapid succession of introductions, names and titles blending together, as Elena shook hands and exchanged pleasantries with cousin after cousin, friend after friend, each greeting polite, but carrying an undercurrent of scrutiny that Elena felt clearly, despite the friendly words being spoken. Baron Edward Lowry proved particularly attentive during his introduction, holding Elena's hand a moment longer than necessary, while studying her face with obvious calculation. "So you're the woman who has caused such a stir," he said, with a charming smile that did not quite mask the sharpness in his eyes. "Charles has told us so little about you. I find myself terribly curious. There will be plenty of time for conversation over dinner, Edward," Elena replied smoothly, extracting her hand with practiced grace. "I look forward to getting to know you better." Edward's smile widened slightly, as though pleased by her response, though Elena could not determine whether his pleasure stemmed from genuine warmth or simple anticipation of the evening's planned entertainment. As the introductions continued, Elena noticed William Grant standing slightly apart from the main gathering, watching the proceedings with an expression that seemed more troubled than the rest of the guests. When their eyes finally met, he offered her a small, sincere smile, different from the calculated pleasantness she had encountered elsewhere in the room. "Elena," he said, approaching to introduce himself properly. "I'm William Grant. I've known Charles since we were boys." "It's a pleasure to meet you, William," Elena replied, sensing immediately that this man's warmth carried genuine substance rather than mere performance. "Charles speaks very fondly of you." "He speaks very fondly of you as well," William said. "More fondly than I've ever heard him speak of anyone, actually." Elena smiled at this, appreciating the kindness in his words, and noticed that William's gaze lingered on her a moment longer, as though he wanted to say something further, but chose to hold his tongue in the crowded room. Dinner was announced shortly afterward, and the guests began moving toward their assigned seats, servants pulling out chairs with practiced efficiency. Elena found herself seated precisely as Margaret had planned, directly across from Constance Whitfield, with Edward Lowry positioned nearby, and Margaret herself at the head of the table, close enough to observe every reaction on Elena's face throughout the evening. Charles sat beside Elena, offering a reassuring smile as the first course was served, a delicate soup that filled the room with the aroma of fresh herbs and cream. Conversation flowed easily around the table, guests discussing recent social events, upcoming gatherings, and various topics of polite interest, all conducted in English for the moment. Elena participated graciously, answering questions about her impressions of the estate, her journey from the city, and her general interests, all while maintaining careful attention to the subtle dynamics unfolding around her. She noticed Margaret and Constance exchanging brief glances periodically. Small signals passed between them that suggested a shared understanding beyond the surface conversation. She noticed, too, that certain guests seemed to be waiting for something, their attention occasionally drifting toward Margaret, as though anticipating a cue that had not yet been given. Elena remained outwardly relaxed, engaging pleasantly with those around her, while internally cataloging every detail, every glance, every subtle shift in the room's energy. The soup course concluded, and servants began clearing the bowls, preparing the table for the next course. Margaret set down her spoon and glanced around the table with an expression of pleasant anticipation, the same expression Elena imagined a hunter might wear just before releasing a trap that had been carefully set. "Well," Margaret said, her voice carrying easily across the table, "I do hope everyone is enjoying themselves so far." A chorus of agreement rippled around the table, guests nodding and offering compliments on the meal. Elena joined in the pleasant murmur of approval, her expression calm and engaged, giving no indication of the careful attention she was paying to every word being spoken. As the next course arrived, a beautifully presented fish dish garnished with fresh vegetables, Elena noticed Constance leaning slightly toward Margaret, murmuring something too quiet for Elena to catch across the table, though the language sounded distinctly different from the English conversation that had dominated the evening thus far. Elena's pulse quickened almost imperceptibly, though her expression remained perfectly composed. She recognized the sound of German being spoken, low and quick, clearly not intended for her ears. She continued eating calmly, giving no outward sign that she had noticed anything unusual, while every instinct she possessed sharpened into careful, silent attention. The evening, she understood now with absolute certainty, was about to become far more interesting than anyone at the table currently suspected. The fish course had barely been served when Margaret Ashford turned to Constance Whitfield and spoke a single sentence in German, her voice pitched at a conversational volume that carried easily to those seated nearby. "She holds her fork like someone who learned from watching others rather than being taught properly," Margaret said, her tone light and almost affectionate, as though commenting on the weather. Constance laughed softly, covering her mouth with a napkin, as though stifling amusement at some private joke. Perhaps she practiced in front of a mirror before coming here. Elena continued eating with unhurried grace, her expression showing nothing beyond polite enjoyment of the meal, though internally, every word landed with perfect clarity. She had expected something like this, though the swiftness with which the family had begun testing their assumed advantage still carried a certain sting, quickly smoothed over by her years of practiced composure. Charles, seated beside her, remained oblivious to the exchange, engaged in conversation with a cousin seated to his left about recent developments in agricultural policy. He had no reason to suspect that anything unusual was occurring, his attention focused entirely elsewhere, trusting that his mother's earlier assurances about a pleasant, welcoming dinner would hold true. Edward Lowry, seated further down the table, caught Margaret's eye and offered his own contribution, speaking in fluent, unhurried German, directed ostensibly toward no one in particular, though his gaze flickered briefly toward Elena as he spoke. "I wonder how long Charles will maintain his infatuation," Edward said, swirling wine in his glass with casual indifference. "These sudden marriages rarely survive contact with reality. Give it a year, perhaps two, and he'll come to his senses." Several guests around the table exchanged amused glances, clearly familiar enough with this particular family tradition to recognize what was unfolding, while others, who had not been briefed on the plan, simply continued their own conversations, unaware of the second, hidden conversation happening simultaneously in a different language. Elena took a sip of wine, her expression remaining perfectly serene, though her mind worked quickly, processing each comment and cataloging it carefully. She had learned long ago that the best response to hostility, disguised as casual conversation, was patience, allowing the aggressor to reveal more of themselves with each passing comment, gathering information that could later prove useful. "She seems pleasant enough, at least," a younger relative offered in German, from further down the table, his tone almost apologetic, as though trying to inject a note of fairness into the proceedings. "Nonsense," Constance replied smoothly, still smiling warmly at Elena across the table, even as she continued speaking in German. "We're simply having an honest conversation. If she cannot handle honest observations made in a language she doesn't understand, how could she possibly handle the pressures of managing an estate like this one?" Elena set down her wine glass and turned toward Charles, engaging him in a brief, pleasant conversation about the beautiful gardens she had glimpsed earlier that day, her voice light and genuinely interested, giving no indication whatsoever of the parallel conversation continuing around her in a language everyone assumed she could not comprehend. "The roses near the eastern wing are particularly lovely," she said. "I noticed them from my window this afternoon." "My mother takes great pride in the gardens," Charles replied, pleased that Elena seemed to be enjoying herself despite his earlier concerns about the evening. "She has an excellent gardener who has worked here for nearly 15 years. As their conversation continued, Margaret leaned toward Constance once more, her voice dropping slightly, but still audible to those seated close by. "Notice how carefully she speaks," Margaret murmured in German. "Every word measured, every response calculated. It's the manner of someone accustomed to performing, rather than simply existing naturally in polite company." Perhaps she learned it working whatever menial position brought her into contact with Charles in the first place, Constance replied, a note of genuine curiosity beneath her mocking tone. "Do we even know exactly what her work involved?" "Something to do with translation, I believe," Margaret said dismissively. "Charles mentioned it briefly, though I confess I paid little attention to the details. It hardly matters what work she performed. What matters is that she performed work at all, rather than being raised properly within a family of consequence." Elena's fork paused for the briefest moment over her plate, an almost imperceptible hesitation that betrayed nothing to the casual observer, before she continued eating with the same measured grace she had maintained throughout the evening. The irony of Margaret's dismissive comment about translation work, spoken directly in front of someone whose entire career had been built upon precisely that skill, was not lost on Elena, though she allowed no flicker of reaction to cross her composed features. The fish course concluded, and servants moved efficiently to clear the table, preparing for the next course while conversation continued to ebb and flow around the long table. Several guests, uncomfortable with the direction the German conversation had taken, attempted to redirect toward safer topics, discussing upcoming social engagements and recent news from the city. William Grant, seated further down the table, watched the proceedings with visible discomfort, his earlier reservations about the evening's planned entertainment growing stronger with each passing exchange he overheard. He caught Elena's eye briefly across the table and offered a small, apologetic smile, though Elena's expression gave no indication that she required his sympathy. "How are you finding the countryside, Elena?" William asked in English, his voice carrying a note of genuine warmth that stood in stark contrast to the calculated performance of hospitality surrounding much of the table. "Quite different from city life, I imagine." "It's peaceful," Elena replied, grateful for the genuine kindness in his question. "Though I confess I've always found beauty in unexpected places, regardless of whether they're grand estates or simple city apartments." "A wise philosophy," William said, and something in his tone suggested he understood more about her situation than he was willing to say openly at the crowded table. As the next course arrived, an elegant presentation of roasted meat accompanied by seasonal vegetables, Margaret turned her attention once more toward Elena, this time speaking directly to her in English, her voice pleasant and seemingly innocent. "Elena, dear, tell us more about your family. Where exactly did you grow up?"
"I was raised primarily by my grandmother in a small town not far from the coast," Elena replied honestly, choosing her words carefully. "My parents passed away when I was quite young."
"How unfortunate," Margaret said, her expression arranging itself into a mask of sympathy that did not quite reach her eyes. She turned immediately to Constance and continued in German, her voice barely shifting in tone. "No family connections whatsoever then. Raised by an elderly woman in obscurity, with no one to teach her proper manners or social graces." "It's remarkable Charles found her at all," Constance replied in German, still smiling pleasantly at Elena, as though continuing warm conversation. "One wonders what exactly drew him to someone so far removed from everything he's known his entire life." Elena maintained her composed expression, responding to Margaret's original English question with grace and warmth. "My grandmother taught me everything important: kindness, patience, the value of hard work. I consider myself fortunate to have been raised by such a remarkable woman." "How lovely," Margaret said in English, before turning again to continue her private commentary in German. "Though hard work rarely translates into the refinement necessary for managing an estate of this magnitude, I suspect she'll find herself quite overwhelmed once the true responsibilities of her position become apparent." The dinner continued in this manner, a carefully choreographed dance between pleasant English conversation directed at Elena and increasingly pointed German commentary exchanged among the guests, who believed themselves entirely safe from detection. Elena participated fully in the English conversation, offering thoughtful responses and genuine warmth, while internally noting every German comment with careful precision, building a complete picture of exactly how her new family truly regarded her. Charles remained largely unaware of the parallel conversation happening around him, occasionally catching a word or phrase in German but assuming it related to ordinary family matters, rather than direct commentary about his new wife. His attention remained focused on ensuring Elena felt welcomed and comfortable, checking on her periodically throughout the meal with small, reassuring gestures. As the main course drew to a close and dessert was announced, Elena felt the weight of accumulated observations settling into a clear understanding of the situation she faced. The comments had grown steadily more pointed throughout the evening, testing boundaries, searching for weakness, building towards something that Elena suspected would eventually require a response. She glanced across the table at Margaret, who was engaged in animated conversation with Constance, both women occasionally glancing in Elena's direction, with expressions of barely concealed satisfaction, clearly believing their carefully orchestrated commentary had proceeded exactly according to plan. Elena allowed herself a small, private smile as she reached for her wine glass, understanding with absolute certainty that the evening's true test had not yet arrived, and that whatever came next would determine far more than her new family currently understood. Dessert arrived on delicate porcelain plates, a rich chocolate creation garnished with fresh berries and a light dusting of powdered sugar. The servants moved efficiently around the table, refilling wine glasses and clearing away the remnants of the main course, while conversation continued to flow around Elena in two distinct streams that only she could fully comprehend. Constance Whitfield, emboldened by the success of her earlier comments and the complete absence of any reaction from Elena, decided to push further, her confidence growing with each passing course. She set down her spoon and turned to address Margaret directly, her voice carrying the same pleasant lightness she had maintained throughout the evening, though her words in German carried considerably sharper intent. "I do wonder," Constance said, "whether she's ever attended a formal dinner before tonight. Notice how carefully she watches everyone else before selecting her utensils. It's rather like watching someone learn a foreign custom for the first time." Several guests around the table who understood German exchanged amused glances, some suppressing quiet laughter behind carefully raised napkins. Edward Lowry, seated further down the table, chimed in with obvious delight at the direction the conversation had taken. "Perhaps we should test her further," Edward suggested in German, his eyes glinting with mischief. "See how she responds when the questions become slightly more pointed." "Be careful, Edward," Margaret warned, though her tone carried more amusement than genuine caution. "We don't want Charles growing suspicious before we've had our fill of entertainment." Elena continued eating her dessert with unhurried elegance, savoring each bite, while maintaining pleasant conversation with Charles about a recent art exhibition he had attended in the city. Her composure remained absolute, though internally, she recognized that the evening's dynamics had shifted into something more deliberately cruel than the earlier, more subtle observations. "Elena," Constance said suddenly, switching back to English with a bright, seemingly innocent smile, "I must ask, how did you find working as a translator? It seems like such tedious work, sitting quietly while others conduct the important business around you." The question carried a subtle condescension beneath its polite surface, and Elena recognized immediately the trap being laid, an attempt to diminish her former profession while appearing merely curious. "I found it fascinating, actually," Elena replied smoothly. "There's something remarkable about being present in rooms where important decisions unfold, understanding conversations that others assume remain private, simply because they're conducted in a language not everyone shares." Something flickered briefly across Margaret's expression, a momentary flash of unease quickly suppressed, though Elena's tone had remained entirely pleasant and conversational, giving no indication of any deeper meaning behind her carefully chosen words. "How interesting," Margaret said, recovering quickly. "Though I imagine such work grows tiresome eventually, always listening to others, never truly participating in the conversations that matter." "On the contrary," Elena replied, her smile warm and genuine. "I found that listening carefully often reveals far more than speaking ever could. People tend to underestimate the value of quiet observation." Charles nodded in agreement, clearly proud of Elena's thoughtful response. entirely unaware of the deeper significance embedded within her words. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something like suspicion crossing her features before she dismissed it, unwilling to entertain the possibility that her carefully orchestrated evening might not be proceeding exactly as planned. Turning once more to Constance, Margaret resumed her German commentary, her voice slightly quieter now, though still clearly audible to Elena across the table. "There's something almost too composed about her," Margaret murmured, as though she's performing rather than simply being herself. "I find it rather unsettling, honestly. Perhaps she's simply nervous," Constance offered, though her tone suggested she found this explanation unlikely. "Or perhaps she's exactly as clever as Charles believes, and we should proceed more cautiously." "Nonsense," Margaret replied dismissively. "She's a translator from an unremarkable background. Whatever composure she displays is simply the product of practice, not genuine sophistication. I refuse to believe there's anything beneath the surface worth discovering." Edward Lowry, still eager to contribute to the evening's entertainment, leaned forward with a fresh comment, his German precise and deliberately cutting. "I wonder what her grandmother would think, seeing her granddaughter dining among people of true consequence. Rather like watching a child play dress-up in adult clothing that doesn't quite fit." The comment carried a particular cruelty that made even some of the more amused guests shift uncomfortably in their seats, though none dared voice objection openly, unwilling to disrupt the evening's carefully established dynamic. Elena's expression remained composed, though something shifted subtly behind her eyes, a recognition that the comments had crossed into territory that demanded eventual response, even if that response would not arrive immediately. She glanced briefly at William Grant, seated further down the table, and noticed his expression had grown increasingly troubled, his earlier discomfort with the entire scheme now visibly intensifying as the comments grew progressively crueler. He caught her eye and offered a small, apologetic shake of his head, clearly wanting to intervene, but uncertain how to do so without exposing the entire scheme to Charles prematurely. "Elena," Charles said, drawing her attention back to their immediate conversation, unaware of the tension building around them. "You seem thoughtful. Is everything all right?" "Everything is wonderful," Elena replied, offering him a genuine, reassuring smile. "I'm simply enjoying the evening and getting to know your family better." Charles smiled back, reassured, and returned his attention to his dessert, missing entirely the complex undercurrents flowing around the table. Margaret watched this exchange with growing frustration, clearly disappointed that Elena continued to display no visible reaction to the increasingly pointed commentary being directed toward her. "Perhaps we need a more direct approach," Margaret murmured to Constance in German, her earlier confidence beginning to show cracks of impatience, "something that will finally reveal her true nature." "What did you have in mind?" Constance asked, intrigued. "Let's discuss her future here, more explicitly," Margaret suggested. "See how she reacts when we speak plainly about our doubts regarding her suitability for this family." Constance nodded eagerly, clearly relishing the prospect of escalating their campaign further. The two women exchanged a knowing glance before Margaret turned her attention back to the table at large, preparing to deliver commentary that would push the boundaries of their carefully constructed test even further than before. Elena, watching this exchange unfold with practiced discretion, understood that the evening was building toward a climax that would soon require her direct intervention. She had allowed the comments to continue, gathering information, observing the full extent of her new family's hostility, waiting patiently for the moment when responding would carry the greatest impact. She reached for her wine glass once more, taking a small, measured sip, her expression calm and composed, despite the storm of cruel commentary swirling around her in a language everyone at the table believed remained entirely private. Somewhere beneath her serene exterior, Elena felt a familiar sensation stirring, the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years navigating exactly these kinds of hostile environments, always emerging with dignity intact and understanding gained. The evening, she knew with growing certainty, was approaching its true turning point. Margaret Ashford set down her wine glass and drew a slow, deliberate breath, preparing to deliver commentary far more direct than anything she had offered thus far during the evening. The mask of pleasant hospitality she had maintained throughout dinner remained fixed firmly in place, though her words, spoken once again in German, carried an unmistakable edge that even the most amused guests recognized as a shift towards something considerably harsher. "I think it's time we discuss the reality of this situation more honestly," Margaret said, her gaze sweeping across the table to ensure she held everyone's attention among those who understood her words. "Charles has made a significant mistake, one that I intend to help him correct before it becomes permanent." Constance leaned forward with obvious interest, while Edward Lowry set down his fork entirely, giving Margaret his full attention. Several other guests around the table straightened slightly, sensing that the evening's carefully orchestrated entertainment had reached a more serious phase. "She simply doesn't belong here," Margaret continued in German, her voice carrying quiet conviction. "Anyone with eyes can see that. She lacks the breeding, the connections, the fundamental understanding of what it means to manage an estate like Ashcombe Hall. Charles is infatuated, nothing more, and infatuation fades quickly once reality sets in." "What do you propose we do?" Constance asked, genuinely curious now, sensing that Margaret had moved beyond mere entertainment into something resembling an actual plan. "I intend to speak with my son privately after this dinner concludes," Margaret said. "I will explain, calmly and reasonably, that this marriage requires reconsideration, perhaps an annulment, quietly arranged, with appropriate compensation offered to ensure she departs, without causing further complications for our family." Edward's eyes widened with interest at this revelation, clearly not having anticipated that Margaret's plans extended quite this far. "You believe Charles will actually agree to such a proposal?" "Charles is a reasonable man beneath his impulsive nature," Margaret replied confidently. "Once he sees clearly, once the initial infatuation fades, and he recognizes the practical difficulties inherent in this marriage, he will understand that ending it serves everyone's best interests, including hers." Elena, seated directly across from this exchange, felt something shift within her chest, a sharpening of focus that went beyond mere observation into something approaching genuine concern. The comments about her manners, her background, even her profession, had been uncomfortable but manageable, the kind of casual cruelty she had encountered throughout her life from people who believed themselves superior by virtue of birth alone. But this was different. This was an actual plan to dissolve her marriage, discussed openly at the dinner table, by the very woman who had welcomed her into this family only hours earlier, with apparent warmth. The betrayal implicit in Margaret's calculated scheming carried weight that the earlier comments had lacked, a genuine threat to something Elena had chosen with her whole heart. She glanced briefly at Charles, who remained engaged in pleasant conversation, with a cousin seated nearby, entirely unaware that his own mother was actively plotting the dissolution of his marriage, in a language she assumed his wife could not understand. The sight of his oblivious happiness, contrasted against Margaret's calculated cruelty, solidified something within Elena that had been building throughout the evening. "Perhaps we should consider her feelings in all this," William Grant offered suddenly in German, his voice carrying genuine discomfort. He had remained largely silent throughout the earlier commentary, but Margaret's explicit discussion of annulment plans clearly troubled him beyond his capacity for continued silence. "She seems like a genuinely decent person, whatever her background. Charles clearly loves her." "William, please," Margaret said dismissively. "Charles loves the idea of her, the novelty of a woman so different from everything he's known. That's not the same as genuine, lasting love. In time, he'll thank me for intervening, before this mistake became permanent and irreversible." "And if you're wrong?" William pressed, his discomfort clearly growing. "If she truly makes him happy, and you destroy that happiness based on assumptions about her worthiness that may not reflect reality?" Margaret's expression hardened slightly at this challenge to her judgment. "I have raised Charles his entire life, William. I understand my son far better than a woman he's known for merely a few months, regardless of how charming she might appear at a single dinner. My judgment on this matter is not open for debate." Constance, sensing the tension building between Margaret and William, attempted to redirect the conversation with a comment aimed once more at Elena's expense, hoping to restore the lighter, more entertaining tone that had characterized earlier portions of the evening. "Regardless of the outcome," Constance said in German, glancing toward Elena with a small, satisfied smile, "I do think this has been a rather illuminating dinner. We've learned so much about our newest family member, haven't we?" Several guests chuckled quietly at this, the tension momentarily broken, though Elena noticed that William's expression remained troubled, his eyes occasionally flickering toward her with something resembling genuine sympathy and concern. Elena set down her wine glass with deliberate calm and turned her attention fully toward the ongoing conversation, understanding, with absolute clarity, that the moment had finally arrived when continued silence would serve no further purpose. She had gathered sufficient information, witnessed the full extent of Margaret's calculated hostility, and understood precisely what these people truly believed about her worth and her place within their family. What remained now was the question of exactly how she would choose to respond, and Elena found herself surprisingly calm as she considered her options, drawing upon years of experience navigating far more consequential conversations than this single, cruel dinner party. Margaret, unaware that her carefully guarded secret conversation had reached its natural conclusion, turned to address the table more broadly, still speaking in German, apparently satisfied that her plan had been thoroughly discussed and generally supported among those present who understood her words. "I do hope everyone enjoys the remainder of the evening," Margaret said, a note of triumph creeping into her voice, "though I suspect our young translator's time at Ashcombe Hall may prove considerably shorter than she currently anticipates." The comment landed with particular cruelty, delivered with a smile so pleasant that anyone observing without understanding German might have assumed Margaret was offering warm hospitality, rather than plotting to destroy her son's marriage. Several guests laughed softly at this final remark, clearly viewing it as the evening's culminating joke, the punchline to hours of carefully constructed entertainment at Elena's expense. Elena felt the weight of the moment settling around her, understanding that everything she had endured throughout the dinner had built toward this precise instant. She set down her fork with quiet, deliberate precision, the small sound drawing brief attention from those seated nearest to her, though most of the table remained focused on their continued conversation, unaware that anything significant was about to unfold. She lifted her gaze and looked directly at Constance Whitfield, whose earlier comment about her time at Ashcombe Hall, proving shorter than expected, still hung in the air, waiting to be addressed. Elena's expression remained calm, composed, and utterly serene, though something had shifted within her eyes, a quiet confidence that suggested the evening's dynamics were about to change entirely. The conversation around the table gradually quieted as several guests noticed Elena's sudden stillness, sensing that something significant was about to occur, though none could have anticipated exactly what form that moment would take. Elena set down her napkin with quiet deliberation and turned to face Constance Whitfield directly, her expression composed and her voice, when she finally spoke, carrying a warmth that stood in stark contrast to what she was about to reveal. "Baroness Whitfield," Elena said, and then, without any hesitation or shift in tone, she continued speaking in flawless, perfectly accented German. "I do wonder why you believe my time here might prove shorter than expected. Perhaps you'd care to explain your reasoning more directly, rather than discussing it as though I weren't sitting right here at this table." The effect was immediate and absolute. Conversation around the table halted entirely, forks freezing halfway to mouths, wine glasses suspended mid-air, as every guest who understood German turned to stare at Elena, with expressions ranging from shock to horror. Constance's face drained of color so quickly that for a moment she appeared almost translucent, her mouth opening slightly, though no sound emerged. Margaret Ashford stared at Elena as though seeing her for the first time, her carefully composed hostess mask crumbling entirely, replaced by an expression of pure, unfiltered shock. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, apparently unable to form a coherent response to what she had just witnessed. Elena continued speaking calmly, still in perfect German, her tone remaining pleasant and conversational despite the devastating nature of her words. "I found the comments about my table manners particularly interesting, Duchess Ashford. Something about learning from watching others, rather than being taught properly, I believe you said. I must admit, I've had rather extensive training in formal dining etiquette during my years working alongside diplomats and ambassadors across 3 different countries." Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her wine glass, though she did not drink from it, simply holding it, as though needing something solid to grip, while her carefully constructed evening collapsed around her. The remaining guests sat in stunned silence, some staring at their plates in evident embarrassment, others watching Elena with expressions of dawning respect mixed with lingering shock. "And Baron Lowry," Elena continued, turning her attention toward Edward, whose earlier confidence had entirely evaporated, replaced by visible discomfort. Your comment about my grandmother watching me play dress-up in clothing that doesn't fit was particularly memorable. I do wish she could have heard it herself. She passed away 3 years ago, but I imagine she would have found your assessment rather amusing, given that she spent considerable effort ensuring I understood the value of dignity, regardless of circumstances. Edward's face flushed deep red, and he seemed to shrink slightly in his seat, unable to meet Elena's steady gaze. William Grant, seated further down the table, watched this unfolding scene, with an expression that mixed genuine astonishment with something approaching admiration, clearly relieved that the deception had finally been exposed, even if not in a manner he had anticipated. Charles, who had been engaged in his own separate conversation moments earlier, turned his full attention toward Elena, confusion evident on his face as he tried to process what exactly was happening around him. He had caught only fragments of the exchange, understanding just enough German to recognize that something significant had occurred, though the full scope of the evening's deception remained unclear to him. "Elena," Charles said slowly, his voice carrying uncertainty. "What's happening here?" Elena turned to him, her expression softening slightly as she addressed him directly, still in German, ensuring that everyone at the table understood exactly what she was communicating, without any possibility of misinterpretation. "Your family has spent the entire evening discussing me in German, Charles, believing I couldn't understand a word. Comments about my manners, my background, my unsuitability for this family. Your mother mentioned, quite specifically, her intention to arrange an annulment of our marriage, with appropriate compensation offered, to ensure I depart quietly." Charles's expression shifted rapidly from confusion to disbelief, and finally to something approaching cold fury, as the full implication of Elena's words settled over him. He turned slowly to look at his mother, whose face had grown increasingly pale throughout Elena's calm, methodical revelation. "Mother," Charles said, his voice dangerously quiet, "is this true?" Margaret opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, apparently searching for some explanation that might soften the devastating reality of what had just been exposed. Constance, sensing the need for damage control, attempted a weak laugh that fell completely flat in the tense silence of the dining room. "It was merely conversation, Charles," Constance offered weakly. "Nothing more than harmless family discussion." "Harmless?" Elena repeated, still speaking German, her tone remaining calm, though carrying an unmistakable edge now. "You discussed dissolving my marriage, Baroness Whitfield. You mocked my grandmother's memory. You questioned my worthiness to sit at this table while smiling pleasantly to my face. I fail to see how any of that qualifies as harmless." The remaining guests around the table sat in uncomfortable silence, several avoiding eye contact entirely, clearly recognizing that their participation in the evening's cruel entertainment had just been exposed for exactly what it was. Some appeared genuinely remorseful, while others simply seemed embarrassed at having been caught rather than troubled by the actual harm caused. Margaret finally found her voice, though it emerged considerably less confident than the commanding tone she had maintained throughout the earlier portions of the evening. "Elena, I had no idea you spoke German. This is quite unexpected." "Clearly," Elena replied, her tone carrying gentle irony despite the seriousness of the situation. "Though I confess, I find it somewhat troubling that the assumption of my ignorance was considered sufficient justification for such cruel behavior. Had I truly not understood German, would your comments have been any less unkind, Duchess Ashford? Or does cruelty only matter when there's a risk of being caught?" The question hung in the air, sharp and undeniable, forcing Margaret to confront the reality of her own actions, without the comfortable excuse of Elena's assumed ignorance to hide behind. Margaret's composure, which had defined her presence throughout the entire evening, finally crumbled entirely, leaving her looking considerably older and more uncertain than she had appeared just moments earlier. Charles rose slowly from his seat, his expression carrying a controlled anger that Elena had not witnessed from him before, though it seemed directed entirely at the situation, rather than at her. He looked around the table at the assembled guests, many of whom now appeared thoroughly ashamed of their participation in the evening's cruel scheme. "I think," Charles said, his voice carrying quiet authority, "that several people at this table owe my wife a genuine apology, though I suspect words alone will hardly suffice to address what has occurred here tonight." The dining room fell into complete silence, broken only by the soft clink of silverware, as servants, sensing the shift in atmosphere, moved quietly to attend to their duties, despite the evident tension surrounding the table. Elena remained composed throughout, her earlier calm never wavering, even as the full weight of the evening's revelation settled over everyone present. She reached for Charles's hand beneath the table, offering silent reassurance, understanding that whatever came next would define not only the remainder of this particular evening, but the entire future of her place within this family that had so thoroughly underestimated her. The silence stretched uncomfortably around the dining room for several long moments before Margaret finally spoke again, her voice smaller than Elena had ever heard it, all traces of her earlier commanding confidence entirely absent. "How is it possible?" Margaret asked, genuine bewilderment mixing with her lingering embarrassment. "How does a woman from your background come to speak German so fluently, with such perfect precision?" Elena considered the question for a moment, understanding that this represented an opportunity to fully explain herself, not out of any need to justify her worth, but simply because the truth deserved to be spoken clearly after an evening built entirely on false assumptions. "My grandmother believed strongly in education, despite our limited means," Elena began, switching back to English now that the immediate confrontation had passed, allowing every guest at the table to understand her words directly. "She saved what little money she had to ensure I received proper language instruction from a very young age. She always said that language was the one form of wealth that could never be taken from a person, regardless of circumstances." Several guests around the table listened with rapt attention now, the earlier atmosphere of cruel entertainment replaced entirely by genuine curiosity about the woman they had so thoroughly misjudged. "By the time I turned 18, Elena continued, I had become fluent in 5 languages. This gift eventually led me to work as a translator for various government delegations, first in smaller regional positions, and eventually within more significant diplomatic circles across Germany and Austria." "Diplomatic circles," Margaret repeated slowly, as though testing the weight of these words against everything she had assumed about Elena throughout the evening. "I spent nearly 6 years working alongside ambassadors and trade delegates," Elena explained, sitting quietly through countless negotiations, translating complex discussions between parties who often assumed, quite incorrectly, that a translator's presence meant nothing beyond simple word conversion. "I learned, during those years, that people reveal a great deal about themselves when they believe no one of consequence is truly listening." Charles, still standing beside his chair, looked at Elena with an expression of dawning realization, understanding now why she had remained so consistently calm throughout the evening's escalating cruelty, why her composure had never once wavered despite the increasingly pointed comments directed toward her. "This is actually how we met," Elena continued, addressing the table more broadly now. "I was serving as a translator during trade negotiations in Vienna when Charles's delegation required my services. He was, I should mention, the only member of his delegation who bothered asking my opinion on matters beyond simple translation, treating me as someone capable of genuine insight rather than merely a tool for converting language." Charles smiled slightly at this memory, some of the tension in his shoulders easing as Elena's explanation provided context for their unlikely romance, transforming what had seemed like an impulsive decision into something with deeper, more meaningful foundations. "I found myself drawn to his genuine curiosity," Elena said, "his willingness to see people clearly, rather than through the lens of their apparent position or background. It's a quality I've found rather rare among people of significant wealth and status." The comment carried gentle pointedness, and several guests around the table shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the implicit contrast being drawn between Charles's genuine character and their own behavior throughout the evening. Margaret's expression tightened slightly, though she said nothing, apparently still processing the full scope of her misjudgment.
"I chose not to reveal every detail of my professional background immediately," Elena continued, "not out of deception, but because years of diplomatic work taught me the value of discretion.
I've learned that information shared too freely often becomes ammunition in the hands of those who would use it against you rather than genuinely understand you." She paused, looking directly at Margaret now, her expression neither angry nor triumphant, simply calm and matter-of-fact. "Tonight, I chose to remain silent throughout most of the evening's commentary, not because I lacked the ability to respond immediately, but because I wanted to fully understand exactly what kind of family I had married into. I wanted to see whether the cruelty I witnessed represented isolated incidents or a genuine pattern of behavior." And what did you conclude? Margaret asked quietly, seeming almost afraid of the answer. I concluded that fear often drives people toward cruelty, Elena said thoughtfully. Fear of change, fear of losing control, fear of a world that doesn't operate according to the rigid expectations we've constructed for it. I don't believe you're inherently cruel people, Duchess Ashford. I believe you're frightened people who chose cruelty as a defense mechanism against uncertainty. The observation landed with unexpected weight, causing several guests to shift in their seats, clearly recognizing uncomfortable truth within Elena's calm assessment. Margaret's eyes glistened slightly, though whether from anger or genuine emotion, Elena could not immediately determine. I have spent my entire life protecting this family's reputation, Margaret said finally, her voice carrying a defensive edge despite its quietness. Protecting our traditions, our standing within society. I have made difficult decisions throughout my life, decisions that weren't always popular, but that I believed served our family's long-term interests. I understand that impulse, Elena replied gently. Protecting what you love is not, in itself, a flaw. But tonight, that protective impulse manifested as cruelty towards someone who had done nothing to deserve it, beyond falling in love with your son and choosing to build a life with him. That distinction matters. Constance, who had remained largely silent since Elena's initial revelation, finally spoke, her voice considerably subdued compared to her earlier confident commentary. I owe you an apology, Elena. My comments were unkind, regardless of whether you understood them or not. I allowed myself to participate in something cruel simply because it seemed entertaining at the time, without genuinely considering the harm it might cause. Thank you for saying that, Baroness Whitfield, Elena said sincerely, appreciating the genuine remorse evident in Constance's tone. Acknowledgement of harm caused represents an important first step, regardless of how the situation initially unfolded. Edward Lowry, still visibly uncomfortable, added his own quiet apology, though his words carried less conviction than Constance's, suggesting his remorse stemmed more from embarrassment at being caught than genuine understanding of the harm his comments had caused. Charles finally sat back down beside Elena, taking her hand firmly in his own, his expression carrying a mixture of pride and lingering anger at the situation his family had orchestrated. I think we need to discuss some fundamental changes going forward, he said, addressing his mother directly now. Changes regarding how this family treats Elena, and regarding the assumptions we make about people based on their background, rather than their genuine character. Margaret nodded slowly, seeming to fully absorb the weight of the evening's events for the first time, her earlier certainty about Elena's unsuitability replaced by something more complicated, a recognition that her assumptions had been fundamentally, embarrassingly wrong. The dinner continued in a considerably different atmosphere following this exchange, conversation becoming more genuine, questions directed toward Elena carrying authentic curiosity rather than calculated cruelty. Several guests, clearly humbled by the evening's revelation, made genuine efforts to engage with Elena as an individual worthy of respect, rather than an obstacle to be tested and dismissed. Elena participated graciously, understanding that rebuilding trust would require considerably more than a single evening's revelation, but recognizing also that the foundation for genuine change had been established, however uncomfortably it had arrived. After the last of the guests departed that evening, their farewells considerably more subdued than their earlier arrival had suggested, Charles asked Elena to join him in his private study, wanting a quiet moment alone with her before the night concluded entirely. The study was a warm, book-lined room that smelled faintly of leather and aged paper, quite different from the formal grandeur of the dining room they had just left behind. Charles poured 2 small glasses of brandy and handed one to Elena before settling into the chair across from her, his expression still carrying traces of the anger that had flared during dinner. I owe you an apology, Charles said quietly. I should have recognized what my mother was planning. I should have protected you from that entire situation before it ever began. Elena reached across and took his hand gently. You couldn't have known the full extent of what she intended, Charles. And honestly, I'm not certain I would have wanted you to intervene, even if you had known. Charles looked at her with surprise. Why not? Watching you endure that kind of treatment, even briefly, was difficult enough for me once I understood what was happening. I can't imagine you wanted to experience it directly. There's value in understanding exactly what you're facing, Elena explained thoughtfully. If you had intervened immediately, Your family would have simply resented me further, believing I required your protection because I couldn't handle their scrutiny on my own merits. By allowing the evening to unfold naturally, I demonstrated something more important than simply avoiding conflict. I demonstrated capability. Charles considered this for a long moment, understanding the wisdom embedded within her reasoning, though it did nothing to diminish his lingering frustration with his mother's behavior. Regardless, what happened tonight was unacceptable. I intend to make that absolutely clear to my mother and to everyone else who participated in that scheme. What do you plan to say to her? Elena asked. Charles's expression hardened with resolve. I plan to tell her that if she wishes to remain a meaningful presence in our lives going forward, she needs to treat you with the same respect she would extend to any other member of this family. No exceptions, no conditions, based on your background or your profession before we met. A soft knock interrupted their conversation, and Margaret appeared in the doorway, looking considerably older and more tired than she had at any point during the earlier dinner. She hesitated at the threshold, clearly uncertain whether her presence would be welcomed. May I speak with both of you? Margaret asked quietly. Charles glanced at Elena, who nodded her agreement, and gestured for his mother to enter and take a seat in the remaining chair near the fireplace. Margaret settled slowly into the chair, her posture lacking its usual rigid confidence, replaced instead by something more vulnerable and uncertain. I have spent the last hour reflecting on tonight's events, Margaret began, choosing her words carefully, and I find myself deeply troubled by my own behavior, perhaps more troubled than I have been by any decision in recent memory. Elena remained silent, allowing Margaret space to continue without interruption, sensing that whatever the Duchess Dowager needed to say required patience rather than immediate response. I convinced myself that my actions tonight served this family's best interests, Margaret continued, that protecting our traditions and our standing justified whatever measures seemed necessary to test your worthiness, Elena. But watching your composure throughout the evening, hearing your explanation of your background and your work, I recognize now that I was operating from fear and prejudice, rather than genuine concern for Charles's happiness. Thank you for recognizing that, Mother, Charles said, though his tone remained guarded, unwilling to fully forgive the evening's events based solely on words alone. I understand that words cannot undo what occurred tonight, Margaret said, seeming to anticipate Charles's reservation. But I would like the opportunity to demonstrate, through my future actions, that I am capable of genuine change. Elena, I owe you a proper apology, not simply for the specific comments made this evening, but for the fundamental disrespect underlying the entire scheme. Elena studied Margaret carefully, weighing the sincerity of this admission against everything she had witnessed throughout the earlier hostility. I appreciate you saying this, Duchess Ashford. I don't expect our relationship to transform overnight, based on a single conversation, however sincere it might be. Trust, once damaged, requires consistent effort to rebuild rather than simple acknowledgement of wrongdoing. That seems entirely fair, Margaret said, nodding slowly. I would like the opportunity to earn that trust, if you're willing to allow me the chance. I'm willing to allow it, Elena replied, though I hope you understand that any future attempts to test my worthiness through deception or cruelty will not be met with the same patience I extended tonight. Margaret's expression carried something like respect at this firm but reasonable boundary, recognizing perhaps for the first time the genuine strength underlying Elena's calm exterior. I understand completely, and I intend to speak with the other guests who participated tonight, ensuring they understand that such behavior will not be tolerated should they wish to remain welcome at Ashcombe Hall. Charles reached for Elena's hand once more, his expression softening slightly as he witnessed this exchange between his wife and his mother, hopeful that genuine reconciliation might eventually prove possible, despite the painful circumstances that had brought them to this point. There's something else I should mention, Margaret said, turning her attention toward Elena, with an expression of genuine curiosity, now replacing her earlier hostility. Your work as a translator, the diplomatic circles you moved within. It sounds like remarkable experience. I confess I would like to hear more about it, if you're willing to share. Elena smiled slightly at this shift in tone, recognizing it as a genuine attempt to build understanding, rather than simply extract information for future manipulation. I would be happy to share more, Duchess Ashford, perhaps over tea sometime this week, when the memory of tonight's events has settled somewhat. I would like that very much, Margaret said, and for the first time since Elena's arrival at Ashcombe Hall, her smile carried genuine warmth rather than calculated performance. As Margaret rose to leave the study, she paused at the doorway and turned back toward Elena one final time. For what it's worth, Elena, I believe Charles chose remarkably well, despite my earlier doubts. You possess a strength and grace that I suspect will serve this family well in the years ahead. After Margaret departed, Charles pulled Elena close, relief evident in his embrace. I'm proud of you, he murmured. Tonight could have gone so many different directions, and you handled it with more grace than I could have imagined. I've had considerable practice remaining calm under difficult circumstances, Elena replied, resting her head against his shoulder. Though I confess, tonight required rather more patience than most of my professional experiences. You never have to face something like that alone again, Charles said firmly. I promise you that. Elena smiled softly, appreciating his sincerity, while understanding that the true test of tonight's promises would unfold gradually over the weeks and months ahead, as she settled into her new life within a family that had finally begun to see her clearly for the first time. 3 months passed following that fateful dinner, and Ashcombe Hall had transformed gradually into a place that felt genuinely different from the cold, calculating environment Elena had first encountered upon her arrival. The change had not come easily, or immediately, but through consistent, deliberate effort on multiple sides. A new understanding had slowly taken root within the estate's ancient walls. Margaret Ashford, true to her word, had begun making genuine efforts to understand her daughter-in-law beyond the assumptions that had colored her initial judgment. The weekly tea gatherings she had proposed became a regular tradition, evolving from stiff, formal conversations into something approaching genuine friendship, as the two women discovered unexpected common ground. Tell me again about the negotiation in Berlin, Margaret said one afternoon, settling into her favorite chair in the sitting room, while Elena poured tea with practiced grace. The one involving the trade dispute between the two delegations who refused to speak directly with one another. Elena smiled, recognizing this particular story as one of Margaret's favorites among the many tales she had shared over recent weeks. That negotiation nearly collapsed entirely on the third day. Both delegations had grown so entrenched in their positions that neither would agree to any compromise, regardless of what benefits it might offer. And you resolved it how exactly? I simply pointed out, quite plainly, that both delegations were requesting essentially the same outcome, merely expressed in different language and cultural framing, Elena explained. Sometimes the greatest obstacle to understanding isn't genuine disagreement, but simply an inability to hear past unfamiliar phrasing to the shared meaning underneath. Margaret nodded thoughtfully, and Elena noticed a small, knowing smile crossing the Duchess Dowager's face, an acknowledgement perhaps of the parallel between this story and their own initial misunderstanding months earlier. Their relationship had grown genuinely warm over these weeks, built not on forced politeness, but on authentic mutual respect that had developed through patient effort on both sides. Constance Whitfield, too, had made continued efforts to rebuild the relationship damaged during that first disastrous dinner. She visited Ashcombe Hall periodically, and while her relationship with Elena remained somewhat more reserved than Margaret's genuine warmth, a foundation of respect had clearly been established between them. I still think about that evening sometimes, Constance admitted during one such visit, finding Elena alone in the garden, tending carefully to a small collection of herbs she had planted shortly after settling into her new home. I behaved rather poorly, and I don't believe I've properly expressed how ashamed I remain of my participation. You've apologized already, Baroness Whitfield, Elena replied gently, and your continued efforts to build genuine friendship speak louder than words alone ever could. Please, call me Constance, the Baroness said, offering a genuine smile. I believe we're well beyond formal titles at this point, given everything we've navigated together. Edward Lowry's relationship with Elena remained considerably more distant, his embarrassment over his own cruel comments apparently proving more difficult to overcome than Constance's genuine remorse had allowed. He remained polite during family gatherings, though Elena sensed he preferred to keep sufficient distance between them, perhaps unable to fully reconcile his earlier behavior with any comfortable ongoing friendship. William Grant, whose quiet discomfort throughout that first dinner had marked him as the sole voice of genuine conscience among the assembled guests, had become one of Elena's closest friends within the extended family circle. Their shared understanding of that difficult evening created a bond that deepened naturally over subsequent months. I should have said something more directly that night, William confessed during one visit, sharing dinner with Charles and Elena in the more intimate family dining room that had gradually replaced the grand formal space for everyday meals. I recognized how wrong it was, yet I allowed my discomfort to remain private, rather than voicing genuine objection. You tried, in your own way, Elena reassured him. Sometimes courage manifests through small kindnesses, rather than dramatic confrontation. Your genuine warmth throughout that evening meant more than you likely realize. Charles, watching this exchange, felt profound gratitude for how gracefully Elena had navigated the difficult months following that first challenging dinner. She had transformed what could have remained a permanent wound within their family into an opportunity for genuine growth and understanding, extending patience and grace to people who had initially treated her with calculated cruelty. The household staff, too, had come to genuinely respect their new Duchess, appreciating her consistent kindness toward everyone, regardless of their position within the estate's hierarchy. Grace, the young maid who had offered Elena a subtle warning before that first dinner, had become one of Elena's favorite members of the household staff, their friendship growing through countless small interactions over subsequent weeks. You handled everything so gracefully, Grace remarked one afternoon, while helping Elena select fabric samples for a redecoration project Margaret had suggested for one of the estate's smaller sitting rooms. I still remember how nervous everyone was before that dinner, uncertain what might unfold. I appreciate your concern that evening, Grace, Elena replied warmly. Even the smallest gesture of kindness matters a great deal when facing difficult circumstances. As autumn settled over Ashcombe Hall, bringing golden light across the extensive grounds and a gentle chill to the evening air, Elena found herself reflecting on how completely her circumstances had transformed since that first tense arrival months earlier. She had entered this family as an outsider, judged and dismissed based on assumptions about her background and worth. Yet through patience, composure, and unwavering dignity, she had earned genuine respect, and even affection, from those who had initially sought to undermine her. Charles found her one evening, standing on the terrace overlooking the gardens, watching the sunset paint brilliant colors across the sky, and joined her quietly, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Any regrets?" he asked softly, resting his chin against her shoulder. "None whatsoever," Elena replied, leaning back into his embrace. "Every challenge I've faced here has ultimately strengthened, rather than diminished my place within this family. I've learned that respect, when genuinely earned, rather than simply assumed through birthright or tradition, carries considerably more meaning and permanence. My mother mentioned to me recently that she considers you one of the most remarkable additions this family has ever welcomed," Charles said, smiling warmly. "Quite a transformation from her initial reaction upon learning of our marriage." "People can change," Elena said simply, "when given genuine reason and opportunity to reconsider their assumptions. I've always believed that judging someone before truly understanding them represents one of the greatest failures we're capable of as human beings." Charles turned her gently to face him, his expression carrying deep affection and pride. "I love you, Elena. Not despite everything that happened that first evening, but partly because of how you handled it. You showed this entire family, myself included, what genuine strength and grace truly looks like." Elena smiled up at him, her heart full with the quiet satisfaction of having built something genuine and lasting from what had initially seemed like an insurmountable challenge. The estate that had once felt cold and hostile now felt genuinely like home, its ancient walls holding not just tradition and history, but a family that had learned, through difficult but ultimately valuable lessons, the true meaning of acceptance and respect. As the final light of sunset faded into the gathering darkness of evening, Elena understood with complete certainty that whatever challenges the future might bring, she had already proven, beyond any doubt, that she belonged exactly where she now stood, not through birthright or fortune, but through the quiet, unshakable strength of her own character.